China's relationships have always been tricky to work out. Friends of Russia and North Korea, but their biggest trading partner remains the European Union. So why then do they appear to be holding face-to-face meetings while welcoming America's top politicians to Beijing? Welcome to Roundtable. I'm Philip Hampshire. They may still be far apart on certain policy issues, but the Americans do at least appear to be talking to China. The same can't be said for the European Union. 3 top US officials have been in Beijing recently, but 2 recent trips by Foreign Policy Chief Joseph Borrell have been cancelled, the second one without explanation.
John Kerry, Antony Blinken, Janet Yellen, all recent visitors to Beijing. But it's who hasn't been going to China recently that's raising eyebrows. Joseph Borrell, the EU's foreign policy boss, caught COVID in April, so cancelled his visit, only to see the rearranged date cancelled by Beijing. Trading partnerships don't come much bigger than those between the two parties, but relationships are at best awkward. Disputes over COVID, Ukraine, and supposed cyber attacks by the Chinese all require diplomacy of the highest order. But was it the words of Ursula von der Leyen on Taiwan that caused China to become so distant?
So let's meet our guests. Joining us from Warsaw, we have Michal Dahl, who's a political scientist and the Dean of Political Science Division at the University of Humanities and Economics in Lodz in Poland. Meanwhile, from New Jersey, we have Jan Bennett, who's an assistant director at the Paul and Marcia White Center on Contemporary China at Princeton University. And joining us from London, we have Isabel Hilton, who's a founder of the China Dialogue. Right, well, if I start off with you, Michal, at the moment, the European Union seems to have a somewhat contentious relationship with China. The two of them purport to be friends. The two of them have very strong trading relationships with one another. But Europe is talking about decoupling itself from China. Meanwhile, the United States seems to have a much more confrontational relationship with China. There's certainly a good deal of friction there. And yet the US and China are talking. US officials can go back and forth to China. European officials don't seem to be going back and forth to China so much. Michal, what's going on?
Well, actually, the European officials are going to China back and forth. So one of the biggest problems that the European Union is facing at the moment is the lack of consensus in relations with China. Both politically and also when it comes to security. You know, there are common mechanisms for decision-making on foreign affairs and economic policy, but the European Union is not a federation. And it's from the peculiarities of the functioning of this international organization that there are strong tendencies for member states to push their own interests. So the transatlantic relationship and its dynamics are closely related to the EU policy towards China. Differences in approaches to cooperation with Beijing are evident when you look, for example, on the Western and Eastern Europe, when you look at the older member states, when you look at the newer member states, making a certain generalization can be noted that Western European countries seek to maintain economic gains from cooperation with China and also advocate greater economic autonomy for the European Union in relations with the United States. And also, when you look at the other side, there are countries admitted to the European Union after 2004. Or even more precisely speaking, there is an eastern flank of NATO, but also some countries such as Sweden and Czech Republic. And those states consider relations with the United States and also the guarantee of stationing American troops and equipment in the region to be a priority.
Jan, what do you make of the European Union's current relationship with China?
Well, first, I'd like to say that both the EU and the United States China strategy, I don't think there's that much daylight between the two. The EU first labeled China as a systemic rival in 2019. The United States has expressed that China is a strategic competitor. So in many ways, the United States and the EU have similar expressions of how they see China in their China policies. That being said, you know, what we want out of China is access to its economic markets. especially for the EU, which is it's a trade union, right? So this is its very purpose, right, is to gain access to the China market. The United States has as well, and this is something that the Chinese government has been promising foreign governments for a very long time, to gain access to the Chinese domestic market, as well as to gain a foothold in various industries in China. That has not come to fruition as what was promised. And this is what the EU and the United States are seeking now.
Well, I'll come back and ask you in a second if you think the strategies of the two sides are working, but let me introduce Isabel first. Isabel, what do you make of the European Union's strategy towards China? Does it make sense from your perspective?
Well, yes, it makes sense. In fact, it's not, as others have said, that dissimilar to the United States, except for the fact that the rather obvious fact that the EU is not, a strategic entity in the way the United States is. But actually, the High Representative, Mr. Borrell, was due to go to China. The reason he didn't go was that the foreign minister had disappeared and has just been dismissed from his post for reasons that are not clear. So, the delay has been actually on the Chinese side. And before that, there's a whole series of people, including von der Leyen and various European heads of state and government who did visit China in the last 6 months. So conversations are going on. But the European attitude, ever since, really since wolf warrior diplomacy and COVID and with Ukraine on top, has simply got more strategic and tougher. So instead of decoupling, actually, von der Leyen talks about de-risking. And I think that comes directly out of the experience of dependency on Ukraine and a wish not to repeat that with China in certain strategic areas. But at the same time, the European Union recognizes that it needs to talk to China about climate change, for example, and that mutual trade is embedded in both economies.
Isabel, you're absolutely right that obviously President Macron of France went with Ursula von der Leyen to China to go and talk to them. But of course, some people would point to that as being the point at which the Chinese got upset with the European Union because President Macron came out with relatively friendly and conciliatory words towards the Chinese government. Meanwhile, Ursula von der Leyen started banging the drum on various other issues, from Taiwan across to trade deals. So has that not sort of, if you like, put a little bit of a wedge between the two sides?
Well, it's not the warmest embrace, but both sides recognize that they need each other. And I look, the European Union is not going to withdraw from its at least rhetorical position on Taiwan, which is that the status quo should not be changed by force, and that's a position that is not going to change. And the Chinese, I think, understand that. But I think the difficulty really comes for Europe with China's covert and sometimes overt support of Russia in Ukraine, which makes certainly the Central and Eastern European states extremely angry, and certainly the Baltic states extremely nervous. And the European Union is no longer driven just by France and Germany and their foreign policy priorities. It does have to accommodate a much broader spectrum of opinion. And right now, that's not very friendly to China.
Michal, so slightly bizarrely, we're in a position here where now I have to ask you, is the friction between the European Union and China actually down to Russia? Slightly strangely, in a left field sense.
Well, certainly, as we have already said, Russia is a problem here, and the situation that's happening in Ukraine is a problem. But this is not the only problematic situation. Actually, I think we can all agree here that contrary to the popular opinion, neither the European Union nor China is concerned with reducing the intensification of cooperation, but rather changing the nature. We shouldn't ignore the numbers. Looking at the macroeconomic data, even from the previous years, the consecutive 3 years, both the EU and China accounted for over a third of the global GDP, and the trade of goods excluded 800 billion annually, I'm speaking euros, So that's for both EU and China. So since October 2022, and particularly since December 2022, so when China lifted the pandemic restrictions, we can witness intensification of contacts between the EU countries and also institutions. You've mentioned President Macron, Ursula von der Leyen, but also Olaf Scholz, for example, of Germany, also visited China. We have mentioned Lithuania. We can also give an example of the Czech Republic. We can look at the 17+1 initiative in Central and Eastern Europe. Those are all quite an interesting example showing that even in smaller regions within the European Union, there are divisions and there is different approach. Putting Russia aside, that's just one problem.
Jan, if we have a look at the European Union's trade with China over the course of the last decade or so, obviously trade's been increasing between the two sides, but China is very much more the larger party in terms of its exports. 20.8% of China's exports in 2022, for instance, went to the European Union. Meanwhile, the European Union, it was 9% of their exports went across to China. Is that part of the trade imbalance that you're looking at here? And indeed, is that part of the friction, or has the European Union merely got to the point where it says, there's a disparity in the kinds of goods that are being traded. We export high-end goods. China exports more manufactured products that might come off a production line. We're okay with that. Is that where the friction is? Because it does seem to be part of the friction between China and the United States.
Yes, I would agree that there is a trade imbalance, and that's something that the EU should ask for in negotiations with China is trade reciprocity. Another thing is that China produces, so let me back up a minute. China does buy products and then it starts producing the same products domestically. So, the European Union nations, as well as the United States, they had this grand idea in the 1990s that China would buy all these American and European products. That turned out not to be true. That is where China could help out a little bit by buying more American products as well as European products. Also, too, European and American companies, they offer services, financial services in particular, that China could purchase. It's not, because it's not opening its markets legally in terms of creating the laws and regulations in order for foreign companies to have access to the financial sector. It's not doing that right now. So that's what China needs to do in order to show that it is being a fair partner in these relationships.
Isabel, what do you think China needs to do in order to fix these relationships with the European Union and with the US? Or indeed, does China need to do that at all? Or can it just sort of sit there and say, well, this is how it is. It's worked so far. We'll just keep proceeding as we have done to this point.
Well, I think a couple of things. China certainly is very keen at this point on more foreign investment. It's trying to recover from COVID. The recovery is not going very well. And if you look at the near term, the headwinds for the Chinese economy are really quite serious and systemic. So China's looking at a difficult period. And I think one way to encourage investment and restore relations would be to open the Chinese market rather more than it has done. I mean, a lot of big European firms, particularly German firms, made massive bets on the Chinese market. So BASF, the chemical company, all the automobile companies, Volkswagen has been selling 40% of its global output in China and manufacturing in China. But we're at a bit of a turning point in terms of the automotive industry, where China is now producing very good quality, much cheaper electric vehicles, which are the next wave, if you like, of transportation. And those German companies are going to be in real trouble. So if you look at what the German Chamber of Commerce, for example, is saying about China now, you detect a lot of anxiety. That is the only country that has a positive trade balance with China. And it looks as though that is going to look very, very different in 5 years' time.
Yeah, now just asked there, what should China do for the European Union and the US? But of course, if I had a Chinese representative here, they might turn around and say, why should we have to do anything? What can the European Union and the United States do towards their relationship to try and fix it with China? A Chinese representative, if I had one sitting here in the studio with me, would say that the US and the European Union, probably more the US than Europe, to be fair, are being somewhat belligerent towards China.
Well, first, I would say that the EU-China strategy, as well as recent comments by President von der Leyen, these are in response to what China has been doing. And if you ask me, China's statements have been exhibits belligerency as well as a certain amount of aggressiveness. You know, I've studied U.S.-China relations for quite a while now, and if it weren't for the wolf warriorism that came out in the past decade or so, the United States would have continued loving China as it did, you know, since the opening by President Nixon. Okay, so that being said, the EU and the American China strategies are in response to what's happening in China. So how can we show good faith? How can these two, the EU and the United States, show good faith to China? Well, I think what is being said right now is that both entities are trying to de-risk. And de-risk means just diversifying its investments around the world. This is what good investment managers tell you to do, you know, for your personal finances, to diversify your investments.
If you're China,
Yes.
Surely that's an existential risk. If China's sitting there and it hears, we're going to decouple, we're going to de-risk from China, that suggests some of the foreign direct investment might be disappearing from Europe to China or from the US to China. Is that not going to cause concerns on the Chinese side?
I understand that, but you know, the EU is a trade union. It needs to protect its interests. The United States is a nation state and needs to protect its interests. This is what entities of this size do. The United States has national interests. It's protecting national security in a number of regions around the world, Europe included, as well as the Indo-Pacific. So, you know, the United States needs to do what it has to do in order to protect its interests. I think that Secretary Blinken has been clear in articulating this to the Chinese government.
Let me take this across to Michal. Michal.
Well, I agree with what has been said, but also it's good to look on the other side. So the Chinese authorities have shown lots of good faith, offering the meeting on very high levels. The Chinese policy, just like American foreign policy and foreign policy of most of the European countries, it's quite logical. So we can see that what's happening is also the reaction for domestic and international factors. Often in public debate, in the West, we do not understand China. We can't read certain behaviors correctly. But I would say the Chinese policy is overwhelmingly rational. So the de-risking policies or decoupling, such words are perceived in China as a way of blackmailing or bad faith from the European Union. So I would say that not only in China, but also in the European Union, we have to work on preparing more coherent strategy and showing more good faith when it comes to negotiations, when it comes to building up future relations.
Isabel, I saw a lot of head shaking from you even as I was asking the question. So, what do you think about the reverse side of what I'd asked you before? What do the European Union and the United States have to do in order to mend their relationship with China?
Well, I think I'd take issue with the notion of decoupling. I honestly don't think anyone thinks decoupling is feasible, and we've heard many senior officials, both in the United States and in Europe, say that. What they are talking about is de-risking. And actually, China's talking about de-risking too. Now, what does that mean? Well, in the United States, they talk about a small yard and a high fence. So the areas which they seek to protect are in very advanced technologies, which China has been investing in heavily. And these technologies are dual use. They're military and civilian technologies. So, there is a strategic element to that protection. For the European Union, that tends to be expressed also in export restrictions, and particularly the Netherlands produces extremely advanced machines which make advanced technologies, and they are restricted, but also in restricting incoming investments, predatory investments by Chinese companies buying up high-tech firms and then repatriating them to China. Now, that's a threat to European prosperity as these officials would see it. And they have to answer to European electorates for the future prosperity of Europe. So on neither side is there very much political room for maneuver. You have a highly nationalistic regime in China, which doesn't give itself much room for negotiation. And you have very defensive politics now in Europe and in the United States vis-a-vis China. So what I think the best option for all sides is to recognize the areas of contention and figure out how to manage them rather than look for an overall across-the-board improvement of a relationship. You can't go back to the way it was 10 years ago, and I don't think anybody will. But you can manage the differences so that they don't become too dangerous. And I think the European Union seeks to do that.
Michal, do you agree with that?
I agree with that. I think that we should properly identify the areas of contention, and also don't forget about the points of convergence. And there are still quite a lot of them. We can even see that when you look at the document adopted by the European Council at the end of June, we can read in the document about shared interest of pursuing constructive, stable relations, about rules-based international order, about some issues that seem not too problematic. And I think if we focus on them, on that less controversial topics, then building up the future relations will be more fruitful and much easier.
Jan, what does China do next in terms of where does it go next with regards to its relationship with the European Union?
Working with the European Union on opening up China's domestic markets, I think would be a start. That would be a sign of good faith that China could make to the European Union. Let me go back to your previous question about a sign of good faith that the United States could put forth. One is to stop saying that China is trying to destroy the rules-based international order that the United States and its allies have so carefully built since World War II. I don't see China as trying to destroy the international order that currently exists. It's trying to make more room for itself, I think, in the current international order, and not to be so under the American thumb. So there are things that can be done on both sides of the ocean that can show better good faith. And part of it is giving way, right? China has to give way on some of its market protections, right? Its protectionist policies that protects domestic companies from free trade. And the United States needs to, tone down its rhetoric on the international rules-based order.
Okay, Isabel, very quickly, because we're running out of time here. From the Chinese side of things, if China did lessen some of its restrictions for imports coming into the country and lessen some of the restrictions on, say, foreign ownership of businesses inside the country, do you think that that would help it get through its current position of 0% inflation and growth that has been coming down from some of the highs that we've seen over the last 10 years? Or would this just make the situation worse, which is obviously what policymakers in China are worried about?
I think they have a lot of things to worry about in the Chinese economy, but I don't think that they're going to be made worse by being more open or improving the conditions for foreign investment. I think that on the whole, foreign investment has been highly productive in the Chinese economy, and the structural problems that China is facing are to do with an aging population, a seriously imbalanced economy in favor of construction, which is now no longer creating value, and a household simply not having enough of the share of the national economy, so it's very hard to create a consumer boom as they wish to do. So those are structural problems which are unrelated to foreign investment, but they could improve the diplomatic atmosphere by being friendlier to foreign companies.
Isabel, Jan, Michal, thank you very much, all three of you, for joining me today. It's been a pleasure to have you on the show. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate if you head over to our YouTube channel. Just go to YouTube and search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me here and the entire team, thank you for watching and goodbye.